There were a couple of controversies at the 2023 Pokemon World Championship, including players getting disqualified and players getting disconnected. There's a lot of misinformation on places like Twitter and Facebook, so I'm here to explain what actually happened because I was there firsthand as a competitor. First of all was that more than a few players got disqualified from playing the tournament, and basically at least 10 players got penalized in some way, and probably more could have been penalized. They were disqualified for something called genning. Genning is where you generate a Pokemon through external software and transfer it to your game, as opposed to actually catching it and training it in the actual game. These genned Pokemon are functionally identical to regular Pokemon, and they offer no direct competitive advantage. Genning is not allowed, but rules against it are also historically not very enforced, but we'll get to that later. People gen their Pokemon for a simple reason. It eliminates a grind. You need 50 Terra Shards to change a Terra type, you need money to buy vitamins to train Pokemon, etc. When you generate a Pokemon, you don't do any of that. You just click a couple of buttons and out pops your Pokemon. There are also certain Pokemon that can only be obtained from older games. To have a competitively viable team in Scarlet and Violet, you often need Pokemon that can only be obtained from Pokemon Sword and Shield and Pokemon Legends of Arceus. Some of these Pokemon are also difficult to get because of specific IV requirements. In later gens, you can use a technique called hyper training to max out the IVs of your Pokemon, but there's no way to minimize them, which is relevant. For example, Trick Room Pokemon like Ursaluna typically want a speed IV of 0. The only way to get a 0 IV Pokemon would be to reset until you get one. Or maybe when you first played Pokemon Sword you got an Urshifu Dark, but your team needs an Urshifu Water. You would have to replay the DLC again to get your Water Urshifu. It is genuinely time consuming to try and get a 0 IV Cresselia, for example, which is a relevant Pokemon. It's not mechanically challenging to do, it's only time consuming because all you're doing is resetting your game over and over until you get one. By genning Pokemon, you get to skip that grind. Accessibility, like in the case of a 0 IV Cresselia, is part of the issue, but I'll be honest. Even if accessibility was fixed in a major way, people would still gen Pokemon. Genning in a Pokemon takes 5 minutes, which is always going to be faster than the hours it takes to create a Pokemon team. While in the past, building an entire team may have taken tens to hundreds of hours, and building a team now only takes a couple of hours is still a lot more than 5 minutes. Even if you improve accessibility to drop it to 1 hour or even 30 minutes, it's still a lot more than 5, so people are still going to gen. Off the record, I'd say around 80 to 90% of serious players in the Western circuit gen their Pokemon. It is part of the culture, and the default expectation is that you gen your Pokemon. Nobody views it as immoral because your skill as a battler doesn't depend on how well you can mash the A button. Catching and training Pokemon is almost wholly a grind. You grind menial tasks like knocking out 26 Flamigo, for example. Genning is a hot topic because there are people who view it as cheating because the rules do say that genning is not allowed. Rules banning genning make sense from the company's point of view because obviously they can't say that hacking is okay. This video isn't meant to be a philosophy debate about the ethics of following rules and the source of moral authority, it's more about what happened at the tournament. But the gist of it is that people who actually play the game and know the grind of making a team don't like to actually waste their time like that, and they view genning as a way to avoid a meaningless time waste. Others view it as wrong because the company said that it's wrong. There's an argument that legit players get a disadvantage because they have to waste time that could have been used for strategy prep, but I don't find it particularly compelling. If you want to talk about time advantages, genning actually levels the playing field. Imagine a world without genning. Top players have friends who can create the teams for them or pay someone to make their team for them too. They typically have more resources than newer players, and they're going to get their teams easy either way. Without genning, a newer player ends up at a time disadvantage because they don't have the connections or resources that top players have, but they would have access to the same generators. I saw this firsthand at this World Championship where top players were able to get the Pokemon they needed basically immediately. In any case, rules against genning have historically never really been enforced. For the past 10 to 15 years, they've enforced it on a cursory level. As long as your Pokemon are functionally identical to a legit Pokemon, they pass a tournament's hack check. Judges can also use their own discretion to ban something that they think is suspicious, like the OT of your Pokemon being hackbot.com. But generally, the measurement is that if it's legal on the online ladder, it's legal for tournaments. But that changed for this year's World Championship. This year, unlike the in-game ladder, the World Championship hack check was going to look at some of the internal data of Pokemon too. And how do I know that? Because they actually sent a warning email. 8 days before the tournament, they informed all players that the hack check would be stricter for this tournament. It felt like a scare tactic because I've never actually done that before, but basically no one was going to take that risk and try to call a bluff for the World Championship. So most people made their team legitimately. I'd say less than 10% of people tried to gen after the warning email. The difference here is that before the rule was bad in the eyes of the players and also unenforced, but now it was still bad, but it was also enforced, and that was the key. But the thing is that a properly genned Pokemon, by definition, will always pass a hack check. The key is to know what the check is looking for. If you know what internal data or checksum or whatever is being looked at, you can modify that too. What you have to understand is most proof that something is genned is just from people being lazy because they know the hack checks are soft and they don't bother fixing the obvious signs that something was genned. If people care enough, they can fix the signs of genning. Most people were scared out of genning, but some weren't and tried to gen properly, because in theory it would work. From my knowledge, most genned Pokemon brought to the event successfully made it through the hack check. But a few didn't, and those got caught. If a Pokemon got caught, you weren't allowed to use it anymore, and if 3 or more Pokemon got caught, then you ran below the minimum number of Pokemon required and you were disqualified. The running theory is that certain Pokemon from Pokemon Home got caught. The most common way to gen a Pokemon is to use a trade bot. You send the bot the data file of the Pokemon you want, and it generates the Pokemon and trades it to you. That way you don't have to do any of the genning yourself. The most common way at this tournament was to gen a Pokemon with a type of cloning. If one person trained a perfectly legitimate Cleaver, for example, and gave their friend the data file of that Pokemon, that friend could then give the data file to the trade bot to gen it. Then, 2 people would have that Pokemon, which is convenient for people who may be using the same Pokemon as a friend. It would theoretically be foolproof because a genned Pokemon would be an exact replica of a legitimate Pokemon. People thought it would be safe, but it appears that these trade bots were inadvertently scrubbing some of the Pokemon Home tracking details. It turns out that the trade bot was for whatever reason removing the Pokemon Home tracker data, and the cloned Pokemon had enough missing data that their Pokemon would get disqualified. This happened to many players who tried the seemingly perfect clone strategy. Instead of cloning, if they had genned in a Pokemon from an earlier game and transferred it up normally, it would pass the hack check because it would have the right home trackers. The snafu with the trade bots is what led to most of the disqualifications. Otherwise, hacked Pokemon were undetected by the hack check. So what does this all mean? This is speculation, but I don't believe these thorough hack checks are here to stay. From my understanding, during a hack check, teams are manually inspected. There's no way they have the manpower to have a physical inspector at every single tournament. And if they had an automated process, they would be using that for the ladder too, but clearly gen Pokemon are usable on the online Battle Stadium ladder. And honestly, even if they did hack check thoroughly every tournament, genned Pokemon would still make it through. At its core, genned Pokemon are indistinguishable from real ones, and the only issue was this problem with the trade bots, but that would be fixed by the next tournament. Stopping genning is not an easy thing to do from a technical point of view, and honestly it looks like they lucked into catching people because of a deficiency in the trade bots. The disqualifications made a lot of people mad because these are rules that have never been enforced, and it was enforced on the final tournament. Several players had their seasons ended through disqualification for something that literally almost everybody does. The culture is that genning is normal, so to get banned for doing something normal felt bad. All the hard work for the season wasted. As for my personal opinion, to be honest, I'm not completely sympathetic. There was a warning email and we had no idea how they were going to hack check, just that it was going to happen. With the knowledge that a properly genned Pokemon should make it through, but not knowing what it meant to be proper, I think it was slightly foolish to stake your season on backing yourself to out-gen the hack check. And as fate would have it, there happened to be an unforeseen problem that caused people to get caught. If there was no warning, I think it would have been very cruel to suddenly implement a hack check, but because there was a warning, if you got DQ'd, you knew what the risks were when you tried it. That's just my opinion. If you couldn't tell by now, I don't view genning as a negative thing in the first place. Reducing grunt work is in fact good and not bad. That's what all technology does. It lets you do more meaningful and productive things with your time. There's no pride in washing your dishes by hand when you can use a dishwasher. I don't judge someone based on their willingness to turn their game on and off 20 times to get a Chi-Yu with a 0 attack IV. I judge them based on how well they play the game. In any case, after all that, it looks like genning is here to stay anyway, but who knows what the future holds. In other news, in the top 16 of the Pokemon World Championship, almost every series got disconnected. I know that because I was there watching it live when it happened. An entire row of tables had a disconnection error at the same time. My guess is that somebody tripped over a wire or something, but we don't really know what happened. Disconnects are unpredictable and tragic because there is no way to save the game state when the disconnect happens. Your only choice is to restart the game from the beginning. The tournament rulebook does have rules on how to handle the disconnect. The way it's handled is based on the game state at the time. If the game at the time of disconnect is a 4v1 or a 3v1, the rulebook says the player wins the game. Any other game state is a tie. However, this doesn't take into account any of the nuance. For example, a situation may be 2v2 but completely winning for one player. Or maybe it's 1v3 but one actually has the advantage. Obviously, the root issue is that disconnects shouldn't happen in the first place, especially not in the World Championship and especially not in the top 16. Also, ideally, there should be a way to save the game in case of a disconnect. But freak accidents can happen and judges have to work with what they have and not what they wish they had, and these rulings are more about how to handle spilled milk. The current system for judging a result is actually not that terrible. If you try to account for nuance, you would need someone with the expertise to read the game situation. That person wouldn't have all the knowledge in the first place, and that person may have a conflicting viewpoint with players. The whole thing becomes a mess. Doing it based on Pokemon count is not perfect, but it makes the best out of a bad situation. Lopsided games get marked as a win and everything else is a tie. The player in the lead will always be mad about a disconnect, but you can't give someone a win just because they have an advantage. Again, the milk is already spilled and you have to do what you have to do. No one is really going to be happy after a disconnect. The issue people had is that it gets marked as a tie instead of replaying the game. If a game gets marked as a tie, it's like both players get 0.5 of a win. In a best of 3, that means if each player wins one game, then you end up at 1.5 versus 1.5, a tie after 3 games. If that happens, the series goes to something relatively obscure called Sudden Death. Sudden Death is a game mode where you win the game if you end the turn with a 1 Pokemon lead. Basically the first to KO a Pokemon. So instead of replaying the game, you play a game mode that your team is not built for and likely a situation that you don't have a lot of practice with because it rarely ever happens. In all my life, I've only ever played one game of Sudden Death. Imagine your World Championship run coming down to that. The reason tournaments use Sudden Death instead of simply replaying the game is logistical. Imagine a 1,000-person tournament, it might have a disconnect round purely because so many players are playing. The next round can't start until all games from the previous round are over, so even one series running overtime affects all 1,000 players. If every round there's a pair playing 4 games instead of 3, you might be adding an hour or 2 in runtime to the event, which may not be feasible. These are worst case scenarios because oftentimes there may not be a disconnect every round and the games may be short, etc., but the general idea is that Sudden Death prevents events from running over time. The problem is that Sudden Death is not a format people want to be playing. In the case of an unfortunate disconnect, the players want to replay the game instead of it being called a tie, and that's why people are mad. Either get rid of Sudden Death as a concept and accept that in rare cases tournaments may overrun, or perhaps limit Sudden Death to non-playoff rounds or only for early rounds. All that being said though, I don't have the logistical details that organizers may be constrained by. Maybe they do have strict deadlines they can't risk overrunning for liability or cost reasons, but on the surface it feels like something should be done about Sudden Death. because it really does feel awful for your World Championship run to come down to playing sudden death instead of the actual format. Almost all top 16 series went to sudden death, but there was one case that went particularly viral. One of the players was one of the favorites to win the entire event, but by his account tied a 1 game because of a disconnect and then lost in a sudden death, which was an inherently variance-filled format. Bad luck may get magnified in a sudden death because you have less time to come back, but also more simply you may run into an unwinnable matchup or a really negative matchup because you never build your team for a sudden death situation. Imagine the number 1 player in any sport or game going down like that. They justifiably feel robbed. It's a tough situation because the judges did nothing wrong. They followed the rulebook exactly. The anger is on the tournament itself for having a disconnect issue and the rulebook for prescribing the sudden death format. Those were the 2 major dramas at the event, and Jenning in particular is always the hot topic, but feel free to let me know what you think down in the comments below.